Hey everyone, welcome back to Revenge Reloaded. You won't believe how fast a lifetime of loyalty can be erased with a single sentence read out loud in a quiet lawyer's office, because that's where my world cracked open. And if you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside by family, I want you to stay with me, because this isn't just my story. It might feel uncomfortably close to your own. My name is Kylie Anderson, and I never imagined I'd be telling a story like this, especially not about my own father, a man I spent decades trying to please, protect, and stand by, even when it cost me more than I was willing to admit at the time. I grew up believing in fairness the way people of my parents' generation taught it to us, that if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and did the right thing even when no one was watching, things would eventually balance out. My dad raised me on that idea. He was a proud man, old school, handshake agreements, Sunday dinners, and a deep belief that family meant everything. Or at least, that's what he said out loud. What he practiced behind closed doors was more complicated, and I didn't fully understand that until much later. I was the middle child, which already tells some of you exactly how this story is going to feel. My older brother was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong, the one Dad bragged about at church and the hardware store. My younger sister was the baby, protected, indulged, forgiven before she ever asked. And then there was me, the reliable one, the helper, the one who showed up. I was the daughter who took Dad to doctor appointments when Mom passed, who managed the paperwork he hated, who made sure the bills were paid on time when his eyesight started to fail. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because he was my father, and because that's what you do. For years, Dad talked about the will openly, almost casually, like it was already settled business. He'd say things like, "Everything will be split fair, don't you worry," or, "You kids will all be taken care of." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I never pushed for details. That felt disrespectful. And besides, I trusted him. That trust would turn out to be the most expensive thing I ever gave away for free. The change started quietly, the way these things often do. My brother began visiting more, but not to help. He came with opinions. He questioned my decisions, criticized how I handled Dad's affairs, and slowly positioned himself as the voice of reason. Dad listened. I noticed how conversations shifted, how Dad would repeat my brother's words back to me as if they were his own thoughts. I tried to brush it off. Families go through phases, I told myself. Don't make waves. Then there were the comments. Little ones at first. "You don't really need anything from me, you're doing fine," Dad would say, smiling like it was a compliment. Or, "Your brother's got a lot on his plate, he needs more support." Each comment landed like a small stone dropped into my stomach. I wanted to ask what he meant, but every time I opened my mouth, I heard my mother's voice in my head telling me not to argue, not to seem greedy, not to make things about money. When Dad's health declined faster than expected, things accelerated. Lawyers entered the picture. Documents were updated. Meetings happened that I wasn't invited to. When I asked about them, Dad waved me off. "It's all taken care of," he said. "You don't need to worry." And I believed him again, because hope can be stubborn, especially when it's wrapped in family. The day Dad passed was heavy, but not surprising. I mourned him honestly. I held on to the good memories. I didn't think about the will at first. That felt cold. It felt wrong. But eventually, the lawyer called, and we gathered in that small office with its neutral carpet and polite smiles. I remember the sound of papers shuffling, the way my brother avoided my eyes, the way my sister squeezed her purse like a lifeline. And then it happened. The words were formal, careful, rehearsed. My father had made provisions. He had made decisions. And then came the line that still echoes in my head. I was not included. Not overlooked, not delayed, not given less. Cut out. Completely. I didn't react at first. I think my mind refused to process it. I waited for clarification, for a mistake, for someone to laugh and say there'd been an error. None came. The lawyer looked at me with professional sympathy. My brother looked relieved. My sister looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The room felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer, waiting to see how I'd respond. I went home in a fog. Anger came later. Hurt came in waves. But the deepest feeling was disbelief. After everything I'd done, every sacrifice, every quiet compromise, this was how it ended. I replayed conversations in my head, searched for clues I'd missed. Had I offended him? Had I failed some invisible test? Or had I simply been too dependable, too easy to take for granted? For weeks, I did nothing. I let the shock settle. People told me to let it go, to be the bigger person, to remember that money isn't everything. Those people had never been erased by their own parent. They hadn't felt that particular kind of rejection, the one that rewrites your entire history in hindsight. What finally snapped me out of it wasn't greed. It was clarity. I realized this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about truth, about accountability, about whether loyalty counts for anything at all. And I realized something else too. My father might have written me out of his will, but he hadn't erased the facts. He hadn't erased the records, the timelines, the promises he'd made, or the legal obligations he'd unknowingly created along the way. That was the moment I stopped being hurt and started being curious. Quietly, carefully, I began to look back at everything. And what I found would change the balance of power in ways my brother never saw coming. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing at first, not my brother, not my sister, not even close friends. People talk without meaning to, and I needed silence more than sympathy. The first thing I did was give myself permission to feel everything without acting on it. The anger, the sadness, the humiliation, I let it all run its course because I knew if I moved too fast, I'd make emotional choices instead of smart ones. And smart was the only way forward now. Late at night, after work, I started opening old files. Boxes I'd kept out of habit more than intention. Bank statements, emails, notes scribbled during phone calls with Dad, calendars where I'd written reminders for his appointments and repairs around the house. At first it felt pointless, like trying to build a puzzle without knowing what the picture was supposed to be. But patterns started to appear, and once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I realized something critical very early on. For years, I hadn't just been helping my father. I had been managing his life. I had signed documents at his request. I had transferred funds for him when his hands shook too badly to hold a pen. I had paid expenses out of my own pocket with the understanding, spoken out loud more than once, that it would all be settled fairly in the end. There were emails where he thanked me. Messages where he said, "I owe you for this," or "We'll square this later." At the time, those words felt like reassurance. Now, they felt like evidence. I made a list. Not a dramatic one, not something fueled by revenge, just a clean, factual record. Dates, amounts, actions. I included everything from mortgage payments I'd covered during a rough year to the renovations I coordinated on his house when he couldn't manage contractors anymore. I remembered how Dad had insisted the house would be mine someday, how he'd said it made sense since I was the one keeping it up. I remembered my brother laughing at the time, saying, "We'll see." That laugh echoed in my head now. What surprised me most wasn't how much I'd done. It was how little anyone else had. My brother's involvement was loud but shallow. He gave opinions, not time. Advice, not money. My sister helped emotionally but never practically. And yet, somehow, they were the ones rewarded. I didn't go straight to a lawyer. Not yet. First, I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. I spent hours reading, learning about estate law, about verbal promises, about something called undue influence. That phrase stopped me cold. Undue influence. When someone pressures or manipulates another person into making decisions that don't reflect their true intentions. I thought about how my brother had moved closer during Dad's decline, how he'd suddenly become the gatekeeper, the interpreter, the protector. How meetings happened without me. How Dad's tone toward me had changed, sharper, defensive, almost rehearsed. The more I learned, the calmer I became. This wasn't a tantrum situation. This was a strategy situation. Eventually, I did sit across from a lawyer. But not the family's lawyer. I wanted someone neutral, someone who didn't know our last name or our history. I told her everything, slowly, carefully, without drama. I handed over my list. My emails. My records. She didn't interrupt much. When she did, it was to ask very specific questions. The kind that told me she was seeing what I was seeing. When I finished, she leaned back and said something I'll never forget. "You're not empty-handed," she said. "You're just quiet." She explained that even though my father had the right to change his will, that right wasn't unlimited. Especially not when there were documented financial contributions, verbal agreements, and signs of potential manipulation. She didn't promise me a win. She promised me a fight worth having. At my age, that mattered more. The hardest part wasn't the legal preparation. It was the emotional restraint. I had to act normal around my family. Smile at my brother's smug comments. Nod when my sister suggested I let it go for peace. Peace is a funny word. It often means silence from the person who was wronged. My brother underestimated me completely. He thought I was defeated. He thought I was too polite, too emotional, too exhausted to push back. And honestly, for a long time, that had been true. But there's a moment when exhaustion turns into focus, and once that happens, there's no going back. The letter went out quietly. No accusations. No shouting. Just a formal notice requesting documentation, clarification, and a pause on asset distribution. The reaction was immediate. My brother called me for the first time in months, his voice tight, controlled, almost polite in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He asked what I thought I was doing. I told him the truth. I was asking questions. That's when the cracks really started to show. The first thing that changed was the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful at all, but loaded, heavy, like everyone is holding their breath and hoping someone else will blink first. My brother stopped calling. My sister sent short, careful texts that said nothing but still managed to say plenty. I knew then that the questions I'd asked had landed exactly where they needed to. Behind the scenes, paperwork started moving in ways I hadn't seen before. Requests for records that should have been easy suddenly took weeks. Documents arrived incomplete. Dates didn't line up. Numbers looked clean at first glance, but when you slowed down and actually read them, they told a different story. My lawyer noticed it too. She called it what it was, inconsistencies that suggested more than simple mistakes. What came next wasn't dramatic, but it was powerful. My brother's story began to shift. First, he claimed Dad had made all the decisions independently. Then he said he was only helping because I was too busy. Later, he suggested I had offered financial help as a gift, not an agreement. Each version contradicted the last. And every contradiction weakened his position. There was one moment I still replay in my head. We were in a mediation room, not a courtroom, but it felt just as serious. Neutral walls, uncomfortable chairs, a long table that forced everyone to face each other. My brother spoke confidently at first, leaning back, arms crossed, like he owned the room. Then my lawyer placed a stack of printed emails in front of him. He recognized them instantly. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened. Those emails were from him to me, sent years earlier, thanking me for covering expenses, acknowledging that Dad would make it right someday, promising that none of this will be forgotten. He tried to brush them off as casual comments. The mediator didn't buy it. Neither did his own lawyer, whose expression shifted from relaxed to concerned right in front of us. That was the moment the power balance changed. Not with shouting. Not with tears. With proof. What followed was uncomfortable for everyone. Old resentments came out. My sister admitted she'd known about the will change months before Dad passed but didn't tell me because she didn't want to get involved. Hearing that hurt more than the money ever could. It confirmed what I'd started to suspect, that my role in the family had always been convenient rather than valued. But there was something else, something bigger. The timeline of the will changes lined up almost perfectly with a period when Dad was heavily medicated, confused, and increasingly dependent on my brother for information. Doctor's notes supported it. Care records showed fluctuations in his mental clarity. This wasn't about proving Dad was a bad person. It was about showing that his final decisions may not have fully been his own. When that realization settled in, the conversation shifted from whether I deserved anything to whether the will itself could stand as it was. Suddenly, my brother wasn't just defending his share. He was defending his behavior. The emotional weight of it all surprised me. I thought I'd feel vindicated, maybe even triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. Sad. Grieving all over again, not just for my father, but for the family I thought I had. Still, I didn't back down. Because backing down now would mean accepting a version of reality that simply wasn't true. Negotiations stretched on for weeks. Offers were made and withdrawn. My brother tried to settle quietly, offering me a fraction of what I was owed, framed as generosity. I declined. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because accepting it would mean agreeing that my contributions didn't really matter. They did. I knew that. And deep down, so did he. Then came the turning point. A financial audit revealed that several large transfers Dad had supposedly authorized near the end of his life were executed solely by my brother. No witnesses. No co-signatures. Just trust, assumed and exploited. That changed everything. What had been a family dispute now had legal teeth. The tone shifted again, sharper this time. Urgency replaced confidence. My brother's lawyer pushed for a comprehensive settlement, one that included not just a fair share of the estate, but reimbursement for my documented contributions. The numbers were higher than I expected, higher than I'd ever imagined asking for. For the first time since that day in the lawyer's office, I felt seen. But justice, I learned, isn't just about money. It's about acknowledgement. About correcting the record. About refusing to let silence rewrite history. When the final offer landed on the table, it came with an unspoken expectation that I would take it and disappear. That's usually how these stories end, quietly, with a check and an agreement not to stir anything up again. The numbers were solid, fair, even generous by most standards. It covered what I'd put in and then some. My lawyer told me I could accept it and walk away that same week. A clean break. No more stress. No more family tension hanging over my head. I asked for time. That pause confused everyone. My brother especially. He couldn't understand why I wouldn't just take the win. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just deciding about money. I was deciding about closure. About whether I wanted to keep carrying this story as a wound or turn it into something solid I could stand on. I spent a long night alone thinking about my father. Not the version shaped by lawyers and paperwork, but the man who taught me how to balance a checkbook, who told me to always leave things better than I found them. I thought about how he used to say that fairness wasn't about equal amounts, but about equal respect. Somewhere along the way, that message had gotten lost. Or maybe it had been overwritten by fear, dependence, and someone else's voice. The next morning, I told my lawyer I wanted one more condition added to the settlement. Transparency. I wanted the full accounting of the estate entered into record. No sealed documents. No quiet footnotes. I didn't want to punish my brother. I wanted the truth documented, permanently. She warned me it would slow things down. I said I could wait. That request hit harder than any demand for money ever could. Because transparency meant exposure. It meant that every decision, every transfer, every change would be visible. It meant my brother couldn't control the narrative anymore. He pushed back hard. Said it was unnecessary. Said it would embarrass the family. That word again. Family. Used as a shield instead of a responsibility. In the end, he agreed. He had to. The alternative was a courtroom, public testimony, and scrutiny he didn't want. The settlement was signed with that clause intact. I received my share, fair and justified, but more importantly, the record was corrected. Anyone who looked would see the full picture. The contributions. The influence. The imbalance that had been quietly corrected. The strange thing was how light I felt afterward. Not happy exactly, but steady. Grounded. I didn't feel like I'd taken revenge. I felt like I'd reclaimed something that had been taken without my consent. There's a difference. My relationship with my siblings didn't magically heal. Some things don't. My brother and I don't speak now. My sister reaches out occasionally, careful, tentative. I respond when I'm ready. I no longer chase approval or explanations. I've learned that peace doesn't come from being understood by everyone. It comes from understanding yourself and standing by that. The biggest change, though, was internal. I stopped minimizing my role in my own life. I stopped apologizing for asking questions. I stopped assuming that fairness would automatically find me if I stayed quiet. Justice, I learned, often requires a voice, even when it shakes. I used part of the settlement to do something my father would have respected. I set up a small fund to help older adults navigate financial and legal decisions, especially those who feel overwhelmed or isolated. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I know how easily confusion can be weaponized. If my story could prevent even one family from going through what mine did, it felt like the right use of what I'd fought for. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not just letting it go. I don't. Letting go without truth is just another form of erasure. What I did wasn't about holding on to anger. It was about refusing to carry a lie. The last thing my lawyer said to me still sticks. She said, "You didn't just secure justice. You changed the ending." And she was right. Because the ending wasn't written when my father's will was read. It was written when I decided my story deserved accuracy. What I didn't expect was that closure wouldn't come from the settlement papers or the bank notifications or even the quiet relief of knowing I'd stood up for myself. It came months later, on an ordinary afternoon, when I received a small envelope forwarded from my father's old address. Inside was a handwritten note I had never seen before. It wasn't dated. It wasn't notarized. It wasn't legally binding. But it was real. The note was short, written in my father's familiar uneven handwriting. He thanked me for always being there when things were hard. He said he knew I carried more than I ever complained about. He wrote that he trusted me, even when he didn't always say it out loud. And at the end, there was a single line that made me sit down and cry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. He wrote, "I hope you know you did right by me." I'll never know exactly when he wrote it or why it never reached me sooner. Maybe he meant to give it to me and didn't get the chance. Maybe someone tucked it away and forgot. Or maybe it arrived exactly when I needed it, after I'd already learned to stand on my own truth without waiting for permission. Either way, it didn't change what happened, but it softened the sharpest edge of it. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like understanding without reopening the door. I didn't suddenly forgive everyone. I didn't pretend the pain hadn't happened. But I stopped replaying the what ifs. I stopped wondering whether I should have been quieter, nicer, easier. I finally understood that being dependable doesn't mean being disposable, and love doesn't require self-erasure. Today, my life is calmer. Smaller in some ways, stronger in others. I make decisions without fear of disappointing people who never truly saw me. I trust my instincts now. I ask questions. I keep records. And most importantly, I no longer confuse silence with grace. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt written out, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside after giving your all, I want you to hear this clearly. Your contributions matter. Your memory matters. Your story matters. And it's never too late to stand up and say, that's not how it really happened. If you like this story, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. Thanks so much for watching. More of my most gripping stories are already on your screen. Click one now and don't miss the best part. You will love it. See you in the next story.